For more than a century, the Andaman Islanders were treated like a mystery the outside world had already solved. Colonial officers, travelers, and early scientists looked at their dark skin, short height, curly hair, and isolated island life, and placed them into one old category. They called them Negrito. Some described them as a lost African people. Others imagined them as a surviving piece of the Stone Age, a human group frozen in time since the first journey out of Africa. But DNA told a different story. The Andaman Islanders were not a living museum exhibit. They were not unchanged copies of the first humans. And they were not a simple African remnant left behind in the Indian Ocean. Their real story is deeper, stranger, and far more human. It begins in the Bay of Bengal, on islands covered with rainforest, mangroves, coral reefs, and dangerous coastlines. The Andaman Islands sit between India and Southeast Asia, in a place where ancient humans may once have moved along shorelines that looked very different from today. Most people now hear Andaman Islands and think of North Sentinel Island, home of the Sentinelese, the isolated people who have refused contact with the outside world. But the Andaman world is not one tribe and one story. It includes different peoples, including the great Andamanese, the Jarawa, the Onge, and the Sentinelese. Nearby Nicobar Island communities have another history again, closer in many ways to Southeast Asia. This matters because outsiders often forced many different peoples into one box. DNA shows that box was wrong. The first mistake was visual. People assumed bodies could reveal ancestry like a map. Because the Andamanese had dark skin and tightly curled hair, outsiders connected them to African groups. But genetics showed that resemblance does not always mean close ancestry. Human appearance can evolve in similar ways in different places. Dark skin can be an adaptation to strong sunlight. Short stature can appear in rainforest and island environments for reasons connected to food, movement, heat, and survival. Curly hair can exist in distant populations without meaning they recently came from the same ancestors. DNA did not support the old idea that the Andamanese were simply a lost African tribe. Instead, their genetic roots sit inside the deep story of Asia. That is the first revelation. The Andaman Islanders were not isolated Africans in the Indian Ocean. They were part of a very old branch of human ancestry connected to ancient East Eurasian and South Asian population history. But that does not make them ordinary. Their isolation made them extraordinary. For thousands of years, small island populations can become genetic time capsules, not because they stop changing, but because they change in their own direction. When a group is small and separated by ocean, its DNA can drift away from mainland populations. Some lineages disappear. Others survive. Rare branches can remain protected because the island is separated from the constant mixing that happens on continents. This is what makes Andamanese DNA so important. It is not a window into a frozen past. It is a window into a separate survival path. One of the most important groups in genetic studies is the Onge from Little Andaman Island. Their ancestry has been used as a clue to some of the deepest layers of Asian population history. Their DNA appears to branch away from many other modern populations very early, which has made them important in debates about how the first modern humans moved across Asia. For years, scientists debated whether Asia was settled by different waves, with one older wave leading to groups like the Andamanese, and another later wave leading to most Asians today. But whole genome research made the story more complex. Some studies suggest many Asian and Pacific peoples descend from one major expansion out of Africa, followed by long periods of separation, mixing, and local evolution. In that picture, the Andamanese are not leftovers from a failed migration. They are descendants of one of the deepest surviving branches of the human family in Asia. This is where the story becomes powerful. The Andamanese may preserve genetic echoes of people who moved along ancient coastlines tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine the Ice Age world, when sea levels were lower, coastlines were wider, and human groups moved through beaches, forests, river mouths, and island chains. They were not marching with maps. They were following fish, shellfish, animals, fresh water, and safe places to live. But the DNA story goes deeper than broad ancestry. It also appears in the maternal and paternal lines. On the mother's side, Andamanese groups carry rare branches of mitochondrial DNA, especially lineages connected to haplogroup M. Two famous branches discussed in research are M31 and M32. These are deep maternal lineages that seem to have survived in the region through long isolation. Every person carries mitochondrial DNA from their mother, and she carried it from her mother, and she from her mother before her. When scientists find rare maternal lineages in a small island population, they are not only reading biology. They are following an unbroken chain of women across thousands of years. Mothers gave birth on these islands. Grandmothers carried children through forests. Families survived storms, hunger, disease, and loss. The DNA remained, not as legend, but as living evidence. On the father's side, the story is just as surprising. Studies of the Jarawa and Onge found paternal lineages connected to haplogroup D, a rare Y chromosome branch found in different forms among Andamanese groups and some East Asian populations, including lineages in Japan and Tibet. This does not mean the Andamanese came from Japan. It does not mean the Japanese came from the Andaman Islands. It means that far back in human history, there was an ancient paternal root shared by lineages that later became separated across huge distances. That is the kind of connection DNA reveals. Not a simple family tree, but a deep human forest. Another important discovery is about their height. For a long time, short stature was used as proof of the old Negrito label, but genetic research suggests the short stature of Andamanese groups may have been shaped by natural selection and island life, not by a simple link to African pygmy populations. This matters because it shows how wrong old science could be. People saw a trait and built an entire origin story around it. But the trait itself may have developed independently as an adaptation to local conditions. In other words, the Andaman Islanders did not look the way they did because they were frozen in the past. They looked the way they did because they were changing, surviving, and adapting. There is also a controversial part of the DNA story. Some researchers once suggested that certain South and Southeast Asian populations, including groups used in comparisons with the Andamanese, might carry a tiny trace of DNA from an unknown extinct human relative. DNA revealed deep origins among studied Andamanese groups, but the Sentinelese themselves remain genetically untested by modern science. One real event shows their independence more clearly than almost anything else: the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. When the tsunami devastated coastlines across the Indian Ocean, the world wondered what had happened to the isolated tribes of the Andaman Islands. Helicopters flew over North Sentinel Island to check for survivors. What they found stunned people around the world. The Sentinelese were alive. And when the helicopter came near, one man came out with a bow and arrow, defending his island from the sky. To outsiders, it became a famous image of hostility. But it can also be read another way. After one of the largest natural disasters in modern history, a people with no satellites, no warning system, and no emergency broadcast had survived. Their knowledge of the land, sea, wind, animals, and danger may have helped them move before the waves arrived. That moment says something powerful. Survival is not always written in machines. Sometimes it is written in memory, landscape knowledge, and generations of observation. In 2010, one of the most heartbreaking losses connected to the Andaman world reached the news. Boa Sr., one of the last speakers of the Bo language, died. With her death, an ancient voice went silent. A language that carried songs, names, stories, and ways of seeing the world disappeared from daily human speech. And now DNA has forced the world to look again. The old view said they were primitive. DNA says they were deeply rooted. The old view said they were African leftovers. DNA says their ancestry belongs to the ancient story of Asia. The old view said their bodies proved their origin. DNA says appearance can mislead. The old view said isolation meant backwardness. History says isolation may have been protection. The old view saw them as people from the past. The truth is that they are people of the present, carrying one of the deepest human histories still alive on Earth. For too long, the outside world asked, are they ancient? But the better question is, how did they survive? They survived because their ancestors found these islands and made them home. They survived because small communities carried knowledge that outsiders did not understand. They survived because mothers and fathers passed down not only DNA, but language, memory, skill, and warning. They survived because some accepted limited change, while others defended distance with absolute force. Their DNA makes them witnesses. Witnesses to the first great human journeys across Asia, witnesses to ancient coastal migrations, witnesses to the power of isolation, witnesses to the danger of judging people by appearance, witnesses to what happens when empires meet small communities and mistake vulnerability for weakness. Some human histories are not waiting to be discovered by outsiders. Some are already known by the people who live them. Science can reveal origins, but it must not become another form of invasion. The Andaman Islanders do not need to be turned into symbols of the Stone Age. They do not need to be forced into modern life to prove they are human. They do not need to be contacted, filmed, tested, or explained for the world's curiosity. Their deepest origin is not only in DNA, it is in the right to remain themselves. For thousands of years, the ocean protected them. For centuries, the outside world misunderstood them. And now, finally, DNA has revealed something that should have been obvious from the beginning. They were never primitive. They were never frozen. They were never a lost chapter of someone else's story. They were, and still are, one of humanity's oldest surviving paths.